Welcome to the tutorial Understanding the Timing in XSheet View, the first video in the video tutorial series all about the timing part 1. So when we're talking about timing in animation, there are several ways of going about setting it. The first way is size of the increments that you use to move a character object across your camera view. For example, if your character starts at the far left and then in one frame jumps to the far right, he'll look like he's moving very quickly. Whereas if you have him move in tiny increments over several frames, he'll look like he's moving very slowly. Another way of setting the timing is the number of exposures that you hold a character for in a particular movement. So you might have a character in one position, and then in the timeline view, that position might last for 3 cells, or what we would call 3 exposures. So that'll look different than if you only held that position for 1 frame or exposure. So before we can really understand timing, we have to take a look at the timeline and XSheet view. So let's begin with the timeline view. So the timeline view is divided into 3 sections. There's the layers section on the left-hand side, the timing section on the right-hand side, and the data view, which is hidden by default. You can access the data view by clicking on this icon here, and it appears. So in the layers section, you can add and delete layers, you can reorder them, you can parent them, and anything that you want to do to globally affect a layer you can do on this side of the timeline. In the timing section, you guessed it, you can do anything in terms of timing. You can add blank cells, you can delete cells, you can extend and hold exposures, whatever you want to do to change the timing. The data view is something that a lot of people are not particularly familiar with. If you use programs like After Effects, you might understand something like the data view a little bit better. You can often uncollapse a layer to see things like its position, its scale, its rotation. I think in After Effects also the opacity, and you have a value from 0 to 100, and you can scale in between those values, and it'll affect the animation here if you have those values keyframed. The values are not from 0 to 100 in Animate or Animate Pro, but you can figure them out usually using the user guide or by fooling around a little bit to see what the scale is here in the data view. If you pass your mouse over one of the cells in the timing part of the timeline view, you can see the name of the drawing. So this one is stars underscore carrots underscore fists underscore clean dash 1.tvg. So it's a Toon Boom vector graphic. Here in the data view, you can also see the beginnings of something that looks very similar, and what that is it's actually, if you're using Animate, the drawing name, so the same thing that we saw by passing our mouse over the exposure here, but in Animate Pro, it's actually the name of the folder that the drawing is linked to, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's minimize this. So the scene I'm working on right now is all about timing. Here's the actual, file that you double click on to open the scene in the software. But if you scroll down, as you remember, there's a bunch of extra folders, elements, environments, frame, jobs, palette library. So if we go into the elements folder, we'll see that there's one called, if we scroll down, so stars, carrots, fists, clean. So if you're using Animate Pro, you see this, the name of this folder right here in the data view, and when you pass your mouse over an exposure, you see one of these TVG file names. If you're using Animate and not Animate Pro, in both the data view and the name that comes up when you pass your mouse over the exposure, you'll see the drawing twice. So you'll see this twice. So one thing that I forgot to mention about the data view is that in order to change the values here, you can do 2 things. You can either hold your cursor over the blue number and you'll see that a hand appears with a double arrow, and that allows you to scroll values like this back and forth. Or what you can do is you can actually click in the field and you can type in a value. And when you do that on the top layer here, so let's recollapse the layer, what you're actually doing when you scroll or you type in a number is you're changing drawings. So when we talked about swapping drawings or creating drawing substitutions, you would scroll through this section to be able to scroll through the various mouths or hands or facial feature positions that you've created for this drawing layer at a specific cell. So now let's talk about the X sheet view. And to do this, we have to bring it up. So I'm going to go to the corner here and click on this down arrow and select X sheet from the bottom of the list. So as I mentioned in a previous tutorial, the X sheet or the exposure sheet in traditional animation used to be a set of instructions that the animator would hand off to the cameraman so that he would film the cells in the appropriate manner. So Animate Pro uses the exposure sheet a little bit differently, but I'm going to go over the various parts with you. There are 13 parts to the exposure sheet that I'm going to talk about, but I'll go over them one by one. So the X sheet itself, I'm just going to expand this to make it full screen, unlike the timeline, is read vertically. So you don't read it from left to right, but you read it from up to down. Each column represents a drawing layer. It shows you the names of the drawings, so this might be a bit confusing because these are numbers, but you can rename your drawings, and then so you would see that this is actually the name of the drawing and not necessarily a frame number. The frame numbers are actually listed here, so frame 1 would be here, and the last frame of your scene would be all the way at the bottom. So in here in the function, well, these are function columns for the camera peg, you can see the actual values of the keyframes, which is something that you don't see in the timeline. You just see a black square, and any line in between indicates that motion path or motion tweening. So in the X sheet view in general has more details than the timeline and is supposed to be easier and faster to read than the timeline. So the exposure sheet has 3 sections, and what I've described to you is known as the main section of the exposure sheet, and it's the only one that's displayed by default. What you see in the main section of the X sheet is just the drawing layers, otherwise known as drawing columns, and any functions that are not attached to a specific layer. So the camera and the camera peg are not attached to any specific drawing layer, and that's why they're shown here. So the second section we're going to describe is the function column section, and you can access that by clicking on this small arrow tab here. And right now we don't see anything because you have to select a specific layer in the timeline view in order to see its functions in the function column view. So I'm going to go back to the timeline and let's enable the punching bag and the punching bag peg. And if you select the punching bag and you go back to the X sheet, you'll then see functions for the punching bag in the function view. And you can always pull this over a bit if you want to see more of the function section of the X sheet view. So the third section in the X sheet view is the column list section, and you can access this in several ways. You can click on the little gray arrow tab here on the right side, or you can go to the X sheet toolbar and click on the second icon, Show Column List. So now it's going to hide it, but you can toggle it and bring it back. Or you can go to the View menu, which exists only in Animate Pro, and select View Show Column List. In the column list, you can decide whether you want to show or hide individual columns which correspond to individual layers in the timeline view. So I could decide to show the door and the balcony, and now all of those columns are being added here, as well as in the timeline you can see they've now been enabled. So the balcony and the door, if you uncollapse it, so not the door peg but the door, are now enabled. And then if I disable these here in the timeline and I go back to the X sheet view, you'll see that once again they've also been disabled. So the door and the balcony here are disabled because I disabled them in the timeline view. You can also decide to disable complete types of columns or layers. So if I want to disable all drawing layers, I can click on this button here, and then you see nothing but the camera peg's path. If I re-enable that, it brings back any of the drawing layers that were previously enabled. And you can do that with function columns, with 3D path columns, with 3D rotation columns, sound columns, and annotation columns. And you can also click on little eyes here to show hide all. So the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is the X sheet view toolbar. So it's this toolbar right here, And if you don't see it in your X sheet, you can go to Windows, Toolbars, X sheet view, and it'll bring up the toolbar if it's not already there. So the X sheet view has several functions that we've already looked at in other ways. So the first one though is show thumbnail. So I'm going to click on this. And the X sheet is kind of daunting to look at if you're just looking for titles of layers, but if you have an image, it's often faster to identify right away that, okay, this is the dojo, this is the punching bag, this is the fighting cloud, these are the carrots, stars, and fists, because you actually see a drawing from that layer as a thumbnail represented at the head of the column. So that's what this first button does. As you saw earlier, this toggles the column list. This button adds columns. This one deletes columns. This one adds individual frames, which is one of these long horizontal looking cells. The scan we're not going to get into. This is create empty drawing and duplicate drawing, the same two buttons that appear as the first two buttons in the timeline view toolbar. And we saw these in the last video tutorial. You can mark certain drawings with key breakdown or in-betweens. This is very much like what you might see in an Excel spreadsheet, the clear exposure and pull. So it would clear, say I selected this drawing 3 here, which happens to be on frame 3 of the fighting cloud layer, and I clicked on this button. Not only would it clear the drawing from this layer, but it would move all the other drawings up one frame. So it would pull everything upward, and you can do a multiple selection and do that as well. So this one is to increase in exposure, and this one's to decrease in exposure. So if I want to hold 3 for 3 frames, drawing 3 for 3 frames, I can do that, or I can decide to eliminate that held exposure section as well. And the last one is to rename a drawing. So you can either click on this and it'll bring up the dialog box where you can rename a drawing, and this is the only real proper way to rename a drawing. So I could rename this as, and say OK. So now this drawing has the name Fighting Cloud. So that, or by right clicking and going to drawing, rename drawing, is the only real way to rename a drawing. If I actually click in here and then change this to 3, what I'm doing is I'm actually now holding this drawing for a second exposure. I've now inserted drawing 3 in frame 4. So if I do that, I haven't renamed anything. Drawing 4 still exists, but it is no longer exposed anywhere. Well, actually I think it's exposed right here, but it's not exposed in this section here. And if I want to bring it back, I can click on this again, and I've called up drawing 4. So clicking in a field and typing in something alphanumeric does not rename a drawing at all. It just calls up drawings the way you would do drawing swaps or drawing substitutions. So like I said, the only true way to rename a drawing is to right click on it and go to drawings, rename drawing, or by using the keyboard shortcut, of course, or by clicking on this button right here. So now let's look at the different parts of the X sheet view. So this white rectangle that's at the top of all of the columns is known as the column header. The title that you see in the column header corresponds to a layer in the timeline. If you're using Animate Pro and the name of the folder that all these drawings are in, like I showed you through the back end, is different from the layer name that's displayed in the timeline view, then you will see both of them listed here in the column header. However, in Animate you would only ever see the name corresponding to this layer in the timeline. If I change this name either in the column view, it'll change the timeline, and if I change the layer name in the timeline, it'll change the name in the column header. If you right click in the column header, you're able to get all the options that you need for the column. You can change its color, for example, to make it more identifiable. You can rename it, for example, by clicking on the column editor. All those types of things you can find by right clicking on the header. So the frame or cell indicated in the dark burgundy color is the currently selected drawing that you would see in the drawing view. So if we go back to the timeline, you can see here that we're in frame 5. If we go back to the timeline, that you'll see that we're indeed on frame 5 as listed here, or if I shrink the timeline again, you can see here we're in frame 5 of the stars and carrots and fists layer. And if we go to the drawing view, you'll see an image from that layer shown. However, all these other gray boxes that you see here shows you the currently selected frame. So it's not just the drawing that's selected that's in burgundy, but it's the entire frame, because in both the X-sheet view, when we're speaking horizontally, or in the timeline view, if we look vertically, anything that's in this column in the timeline view is seen in the camera view, as long as it's enabled here in the timeline. So that's what that gray row is. The gray row would be all of these frames on frame 5, but that correspond to different layers. So as I mentioned before, these are the frame numbers. You can click on any of them to go to that frame. So if I click on frame 12, and the playhead in the timeline is now at frame 12, we can see that here again as well. And if you want to select multiple drawings, you just need to click and drag, and then you're selecting all the cells from all the different layers or columns for these 5 frames. So in the timeline it would look vertical. You'd be selecting the equivalent of frame 12 to, let's say, 18 here, like this. So that's what you would be essentially doing. As I mentioned before, the way you can tell that an exposure has been held for multiple frames is by this long black line that you see. So we know from here to here, drawing 1 is held for all of these frames. In the timeline view, what that looks like is this. So there's no actual cut between any of these frames. It's just one long gray bar with what looks like a ruler with small little notches, but it's not like the row above where you see full lines breaking up this row. And so we know that for the text, it's the same text for every single one of these frames from frame 1 to, I think, frame 127, where here they're clearly all different all the way down. These black lines that demarcate that there's a held exposure also exist because there are certain areas where there are no drawings that exist at all. So from frame 20 to 30 in column stars, carets, and fifths, there are no drawings at all. And so I'm not confused about that because there's no line here, there's no held exposure. So I know for sure that these cells are empty. I know for sure that these cells are filled with drawings. So it's one of the last few things I'd like to show you. Here at the bottom of the X sheet, you have the current frame listed, so that would be frame 12. And if we look over here, indeed that's true. And then after the colon, you have the name of the column where the currently selected drawing exists. So our currently selected drawing is what's in burgundy, which is drawing number 8, and indeed it belongs to the column stars, carets, and fists. And here we have quick add or subtract exposure field. And so if we select our drawing, and we know it's selected for sure because of this black border around it, so it not only has to be burgundy, but it has to have this black border around it, you can add and subtract exposures quite quickly. And it's the same as what you do here with this button, the only difference being that you can add a big amount quickly or a large amount quickly. So instead of clicking 30 times, I can just add the value 30 into this field, and now drawing 8 has been held for 30 exposures. And I can actually bring it back very quickly as well by doing the same thing. Then lastly over here you can see the word overwrite. I hope you can see that. And if you click on it, you can see that it is changed to the word insert, and you can click back and forth or toggle between those two. It might look slightly different on Windows, I'm not exactly sure. But what this does is it programs the way that values are inserted into your X sheet. So whether you'd want current values to be overwritten or to be inserted between existing values. And by default, it's set to overwrite. So let's take a look at the function section of the X sheet. So for that, I have to go back into the timeline and select a layer that has some functions associated with it. And so we'll select the punching bag again. And I'll go back to the X sheet view. So these columns, so position X, position Y, position Z, this might look familiar to you. Scale, skew, all those things you've seen before in the timeline. So if you uncollapse, the punching bag, you'll see the same things: position X, Y, Z, scale, angle, skew. And then if you go into the X sheet, you'll notice there are certain frames that have black boxes in them, and these black boxes represent keyframes. Not only can you keyframe values for drawing layers, so position and rotation like we discussed, but for effects layers you can key the intensity values. So for example, if I had a transparency effect in my timeline or in my network view, I could see the columns here for the intensity of that transparency. So 100% opaque, or I guess that would be 0 transparency. You could then key those values and have its associated drawing layer go from completely opaque to completely transparent and then back again. So those things you can also control in the function section of the XSheet view. So that's pretty much it for the video understanding the timeline and XSheet view. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, Frames.